All right, so my goal over the next 10 minutes is to convince all of you, including you, Dr. Byrne, that by simply paying close attention to oxygenation after cardiac arrest, we have the potential to save lives and improve neurological outcome. So this may come as a surprise to many people here, but hypoxia is bad. Yes, I know, mind-blowing stuff that we're starting with. And this person here is not doing so well, okay? And they're going to do a lot worse if they don't surface and get adequate oxygen. So as a caveat to everything that I'm about to say, first and foremost, we need to be preventing hypoxia in our brain-injured post-cardiac arrest patients. We need to get them to surface. So as the current post-cardiac arrest guidelines recommend that we start with an FiO2 of 100% immediately after return of spontaneous circulation in an effort to prevent ongoing hypoxia. So step one, prevent hypoxia. So what about the other end of that spectrum, hyperoxia? Well, this is America, and in America, more is better, right? But can we have too much of a good thing? So if we think about it, during cardiac arrest, ischemia damages mitochondria, and it depletes our free radical scavenger stores. And then after return of spontaneous circulation, oxygen now returns to the damaged mitochondria, and in the process of aerobic metabolism, we produce reactive oxygen species. Now these free radicals go on to promote cellular damage and cellular death. So in theory, if after return of spontaneous circulation, we have extra oxygen hitting these damaged mitochondria, we could more likely have increased free radicals, thus more cellular damage, more cellular death. Specifically neuronal death. So does this pan out clinically? Well, back in 2010, Dr. Hope Kilgannon and our group, along with Dr. Treziak, had a large registry paper published in JAMA, in which we compared normoxia, a PaO2 of 60 to 300 millimeters of mercury, to hyperoxia, or a PaO2 greater than 300. And we found that hyperoxia was independently associated with in-hospital mortality. In fact, patients who had exposure to hyperoxia were almost 2 times as likely to die in hospital as patients who maintained normoxia. So since our initial publication, there have been several studies that have come out looking at the association between PaO2 and clinical outcomes. Now, some of the studies have replicated what we found initially, whereas several studies actually concluded no association between hyperoxia and poor outcomes. However, if we delve in and look at the actual distribution of data, we see that these studies still demonstrated somewhat of a U-shaped curve. And although some studies did not find a statistically significant association between hyperoxia and poor outcome, there was still this trend towards harm. And in fact, no study to date has found any suggestion of benefit from hyperoxia in post-arrest patients. So the point I'm trying to drive home here is that although the data so far is all observational and we cannot infer causation, there is a good body of evidence suggesting an association between hyperoxia and harm with no suggestion of benefit. Now these studies have a lot of important limitations that we need to consider. Most notably, although some were large registry studies, they were all retrospective in design. And they relied on the timing of the treating physician. They relied on the timing of ABGs was reliant on the treating physician. So within each study, the timing of PaO2 measurement was arbitrary and varied from patient to patient, allowing for potential or significant measurement bias. So immediately after our initial study, we started the reoxygenation after cardiac arrest, or REOX study. And this was funded by the NIH, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. It's multi-centered, fully prospective, protocol-directed, observational study in which we obtained arterial blood gases at 1 and 6 hours after return of spontaneous circulation. And we again defined hyperoxia as a PaO2 greater than 300 millimeters of mercury over that 6-hour time period. And we chose the 6 hours to define our exposure based on the hypothesis that the early hours after reperfusion are when the injured brain was most susceptible to secondary injury. And our primary outcome was poor neurological function at hospital discharge, i.e. functionally dependent on others for daily living, or they died in hospital. So this data, like Dr. Kilgannon said, is unpublished. It's actually currently under peer review. And what we found was that patients who had exposure to hyperoxia were almost 2.5 times more likely to have a poor neurological outcome. And they were almost 2 times as likely to simply die in hospital. We also went on to look at the duration of hyperoxia exposure. And we found that over the first 6 hours, for every hour that hyperoxia went uncorrected, there was a 22% increased risk of poor neurological outcome. And I think this number really drives home the mantra of don't just set it and forget it. And that in patients who we can safely do so, we should really be titrating down that FiO2 as opposed to just leaving it at 100% and walking out of the room. So how can we safely titrate down? Well, like I said, we're going to be starting with 100% FiO2 because first and foremost, we need to prevent hypoxia in these patients. Then we can use pulse oximetry to sort of guide our titration down. And if we have a good waveform and an oxygen saturation greater than 94%, it's likely safe to start titrating down. And I'll titrate down as low as I can go while maintaining an oxygen saturation of 94% or above. I wouldn't recommend going below 21%. It's usually nice, whatever I'm breathing, I feel like I at least should be giving that much to my patient, not depriving them of oxygen. And interestingly, although pulse oximetry is very good at identifying hypoxia, in the REOX study, we found that there was no specific oxygen saturation that reliably ruled out hyperoxia with 100% sensitivity. In addition, we found hyperoxia exposure occurred in patients with FiO2s as low as 40%. So this highlights the importance of early arterial blood gas draws so that we ensure that we've achieved normoxia. All right, so what should we be targeting? Well, first, I'm going to drive it home one more time, avoid hypoxia. And I would recommend following the current post-cardiac arrest guidelines, which all pretty much say the same thing of making sure we have an oxygen saturation of 94% or above. Some of you may be familiar with the Hot or Not trial. This was a study that in the pre-hospital setting, they randomized post-arrest patients to either the highest possible FiO2 or titrating down to an oxygen saturation of 90 to 94%. And that study was actually halted earlier because the titration group had a higher incidence of hypoxia. Not very surprising. Now, these results may have been different had that titration occurred in hospital, but I think it sort of adds to the evidence that we probably don't want to be dropping our saturation much lower than this at this time. Then once we've ensured that our patients are not hypoxic, then we should start titrating down that FiO2, obtain an arterial blood gas to ensure our PaO2 is at least below 300 millimeters of mercury. Our unpublished data suggests that's where most of the harm is. Now, there's studies in other forms of ventilated patients demonstrating that lower thresholds are probably even better. But for our post-arrest patients right now, the data, we need to be at least below 300 millimeters of mercury. All right, so in conclusion, don't just set it and forget it. This is a simple intervention with the potential to save lives and improve neurological outcome. Take questions.